So in the peripheral nervous system, this is the system which allows us to communicate with everything that's around us. It's a to and fro communication. So you take information around us and then send it to the central nervous system, and then from the central nervous system, this is the way that information can come out and come to our muscles. So far you did the central nervous system, which was the brain and spinal cord, which was lodged in the dorsal body cavity. Everything outside of that belongs to the peripheral nervous system. And when we first started, we talked of cranial and spinal nerves, so they definitely belong to the peripheral nervous system. But along with the cranial and spinal nerves, we'll also find some ganglia which are interspersed on their way. And we'll find receptors, that means areas from which the sensation actually begins. And then muscles have motor nerve endings in them, so those muscles and glands, so those are the motor endings. So that also is outside of the CNS and belongs to the peripheral nervous system. This peripheral nervous system is a to and fro communication from the world around us to the central nervous system. So it has a part which sends information to the central nervous system. So that part is called sensory or afferent division. Then it has a portion where the communication is reversed. That means it's from the brain and spinal cord through these spinal and cranial nerves to the muscles and glands, right? Information coming out. So this is kind of review. So that is called motor or efferent division. I always like to pronounce it as afferent and efferent so that you don't make a mistake between the R and the E, okay? So as if you were to kind of graph this out or chart this out, so here's the peripheral nervous system. It has a sensory division and it has a motor division. Sensory division is where the information goes from the periphery. It goes via the peripheral nervous system and then goes to the central nervous system. The motor division is where information is coming out from the central nervous system using the peripheral nervous system and then going to muscles and glands. When that information goes to skeletal muscle, it is part of the somatic nervous system, because remember, the somatic nervous system supplied skeletal muscle. So when it goes to skeletal muscle, it's part of the somatic nervous system. When it goes to cardiac muscle or smooth muscle or glands, then it belongs to what we call the involuntary or autonomic nervous system. And the autonomic nervous system has two parts to it, a sympathetic and a parasympathetic. So we'll be doing this autonomic nervous system separately. So you can see the motor or efferent division has a somatic part to it, which is going to skeletal. It has a cardiac and smooth and glandular part, which is part of the autonomic nervous system. This sensory division, which is through which sensations are carried to the central nervous system via the peripheral nervous system, this, when it goes from the skin and muscles and joints, then that part is somatic. And when it goes from organs, then we call it visceral. So there is a visceral sensory and there is a somatic sensory. So this is, we did this earlier, so I'm just reviewing it. So when sensations go from skin, just like pain, temperature, touch, pressure, or a sensation is going from your eye, like vision and so on, right? Or from ear, hearing, taste. So that all vision, taste and all that is known as special sensation. When it goes from the skin, it's known as general sensation. But you can also have sensation going from muscles. For example, if you know how much your muscle has flexed or how much the muscle has extended or abducted. So that's known as muscle sense. That is also going from the periphery. Or from joints. So, you know, if you want to know whether your joint, the position of your joint. So with your eyes closed, if someone flexed your fingers, you could tell, the brain can tell whether your fingers are flexed or extended. That's known as joint sense. That's information being carried to the brain. So that all of that is part of what is called somatic sensory. When the information goes from the organs, in sensation of pain from the organs, that is known as visceral sensory. Okay? So the somatic nervous system, you can see, has a motor division. It also has a sensory division. This autonomic nervous system only has a motor division because it's going to cardiac muscle, smooth muscle and glands. This visceral sensory is a separate part by itself, but in order to reach the central nervous system, it kind of travels for part of the way with the somatic nervous system. Now let's look at the sensory portion. So the sensory portion begins with receptors which are present either in the skin, or their receptors are present within muscles, or receptors are present inside the joints like we talked of, or you might have receptors which are present inside walls of organs. So they are, different, these receptors. So these receptors they may be part of a nerve, or they may be separate cells as it is. So when they are separate cells, for example, you have special cells present in the eye which are known as rods and cones. So the rods and cones serve as receptors for vision. Otherwise, you have parts of a nerve, for example, the first cranial nerve which we'll do is called the olfactory nerve. The endings of that cranial nerve serve as receptors for the sense of smell. Okay? What these receptors do is they respond to a stimulus, then they send that impulse to the brain where you become aware of that stimulus, and then inside the brain interprets what kind of stimulus is it. For example, if somebody pricks you, that information is sent from the receptor, it is sent to the brain, so you become aware of pricking, and then when it interprets it, it tells you that, oh, you felt pain in that area. So that interpretation is the sensation you actually feel, pain or temperature or deep touch or pressure. So that's the interpretation which occurs. And then your reaction is determined based on that interpretation. So for example, it was a light touch on your finger, maybe you don't need to react at all. If on the other hand you got burnt by something, you will react, right? You will draw that part away from that. So there is first awareness where you're aware that something has stimulated you, and then there is a perception where you are able to identify what kind of stimulus it is. All of that goes on inside the brain, so you're not even aware of it. Some other examples of sensory receptors are free nerve endings which are responsible for pain. They carry the sensation of pain. There are others like Merkel's disc, Pacinian corpuscles. These are present in the skin and respond to touch and pressure. Inside muscles, you have little receptors called muscle spindles which tells you the amount of tension developed in the muscle. So, it tells the brain that, okay, you don't need to contract any further. And then we have Golgi tendon organs very close to the tendon, where the tendon is close to a joint. So these are some receptors. Based on the type of sensation that is felt, we can also broadly classify receptors into different types. Mechanoreceptors are receptors which respond to mechanical stimulation. So like touch, pressure, pain, all of these are mechanoreceptors. So free nerve endings, Merkel's disc, these will come under mechanoreceptors. Nociceptors are for pain, and actually, free nerve endings really come under nociceptors, Merkel's disc, Pacinian corpuscles, all that respond to touch, temperature, those come under mechanoreceptors. For pain, there's a separate kind of receptor called nociceptors or nociceptors, and free nerve endings are the ones which respond to pain. Proprioceptors are present in muscles and joints, so these Golgi tendon organs and the muscle spindles, they advise the brain of movement. The muscle is so tense, or the joint has moved in this particular direction. So that kind of information is called proprioception. Chemoreceptors respond to chemicals. usually in vapor or solution form. Like, when you smell something, those are chemicals, pungent fumes that you have, those are chemicals. Thermoreceptors are which respond to temperature. So, further breakdown of the mechanoreceptors, so responding to temperature. And then photoreceptors will respond to light, vision. So, for example, rods and cones will come under photoreceptors. So let's say you drank orange juice, which kind of receptor would be stimulated? Yeah, drinking orange juice. Which type of receptor would be stimulated? Chemoreceptors, yes, excellent. It will stimulate the chemoreceptors. Orange juice has certain chemicals inside it, and it's chemoreceptors, certainly not photoreceptors, nothing to do with joint and muscle sense, and certainly doesn't cause pain. So chemoreceptors. So now we began from the receptor. So let's see its pathway into the brain, and we did some of this. So the awareness of a stimulus, which is carried through a receptor, triggers a sensation which is perceived inside the brain. So first you are aware, and then it is interpreted in the brain, and then a response is determined accordingly. So how does this actually reach the brain? So let's connect that. So if you remember, where does most of the sensation go? Which lobe of the brain perceives most of the sensation? Pardon? Which one? No, thalamus is not a lobe of the brain. Thalamus is a relay station. Amongst the lobes of the brain, which lobe? The parietal lobe, yes. So the parietal lobe, yes, temporal is responsible for hearing, and occipital lobe is responsible for vision, and the cerebellum for balance, but otherwise most other sensations go to the parietal lobe of the brain. So we got that. So it's going into the parietal lobe of the brain. So how does it reach there? So from the stimulus, whatever the stimulus is, let's say somebody poked you on the finger, there are nociceptors present on your finger. From those receptors, it will travel by means of spinal nerves, and it will go into the spinal cord, where inside the spinal cord there will actually be a synapse. The synapse is shown a little higher up. So from there, the second neuron will start, and this second neuron will travel all the way up and go and synapse in the thalamus. And from the thalamus, the third neuron will go and synapse in the sensory cortex, which is present in the parietal lobe, right? This travel which happens in the spinal cord and along the brain stem and then going all the way up to the parietal lobe, this was what you saw as tracks. If you remember, we had ascending tracks. We call them ascending or sensory tracks. So all pain sensations from anywhere in the body travel in one tract. It just so happens, for example, there's a tract called the spinothalamic tract, which carries pain sensations. So pain from anywhere in the body all go together, so that, it's like keeping everything very, very organized. On the other hand, proprioception from everywhere in the body goes in another tract, which is called dorsal column tract. Touch goes in another tract. So everything is kind of organized. So be it from free nerve endings which carry pain, or be it from muscle spindles which carry proprioception, or be it from the joints, which again carries proprioception. Based on what type of sensation it is, they will get into the spinal cord. Most of them synapse there, and then a second neuron starts, goes to the thalamus, and the third neuron and synapses there. That's why the thalamus is the main sensory relay station. And from the thalamus, it goes to the parietal lobe. Some of them may not synapse in the spinal cord, in which case they synapse in the brain stem, in the medulla, and then the second neuron goes to the thalamus and goes up there. So they all get grouped together based on what type of sensation they are carrying, right? So let's take a look at this so that it shows you this pathway. So he's describing one pathway, which is this pathway carrying pain and temperature and all that. He will mention a few things in this video which you can kind of, I don't mention them, or something called tract of Leesor or whatever. You can ignore all of that, but just see how the path goes all the way up to the brain, okay?
Is the third in the spinal pathways series, and in this video we will be discussing the spinothalamic tract. The spinothalamic tract is a pathway which conveys the sensation of pain, temperature, and crude touch. The pathway begins with nerve endings or receptors in the body, sending information down the axon of a neuron. These neurons are pseudo-unipolar neurons with cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion, just like the ones we saw in the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway. Now here's a slice of the spinal cord, and here is Lascelles fasciculus. The spinothalamic tract enters the spinal cord and ascends or descends 1 or 2 levels within Lascelles fasciculus.
So you can ignore this Lascelles fasciculus, but just follow along after this.
Then it synapses onto a cell body in the dorsal horn of the grey matter. The dorsal horns are the back parts of the butterfly wings of the grey matter. The axon from this neuron then decussates, which you'll remember means to cross to the other side, and then ascends via the spinothalamic fasciculus. This decussation is called the anterior white commissure. It is also important in the corticospinal tract, which we will discuss in the next tutorial. These neurons here are located within the substantia gelatinosa, or the nucleus proprius, both of which are collections of cell bodies within the dorsal horn. The spinothalamic tract then ascends through the brainstem and synapses onto the thalamus. This is why the tract is called the spinothalamic tract, because it ascends from the spinal cord to the thalamus. The thalamus then sends projections to the post-central gyrus of the cortex. This is the same part of the cortex to which the dorsal column medial lemniscus pathway projected. They both project to the post-central gyrus because they are both sensory pathways, and the post-central gyrus is a primary sensory area. Now I'll finish by reiterating that Lascelles...
So here he showed you how it travels exactly all the way through. So if you notice, there were 3 neurons which you had. You also saw that it started on one side but crossed over on the other side, because remember we said that the cerebral hemispheres control the opposite side of the body. So information from the right side will go to the left post-central gyrus. You also saw how he mentioned that this spinothalamic tract, so we saw all those tracts, and this was going up, so it was an ascending tract, which means it's a sensory tract. And you also saw how he told you that this tract carried this information: pain, temperature, and crude touch. So there were other tracts which he didn't mention, but those other tracts carry other different types of sensations. So tracts, if you remember when we did the spinal cord, we saw that there were particular locations in the spinal cord where all these tracts were located, and that's because each tract carries a specific type of sensation, or maybe some of those tracts are descending tracts. So everything is very, very organized within the spinal cord and the brain. And this to and fro pathway which we have up and down the spinal cord and towards the brain, that is what we saw earlier in the central nervous system. Those were the tracts. So now all of this information was carried, from the receptor till it entered into the spinal cord or till it goes up to the brain. This is called, the nerves take that information. So they were cranial or spinal nerves. So when you look at a nerve is really made up of many axons. And if we kind of compare this to muscles, if you remember, a muscle was made up of many muscle fibers. But these muscle fibers were grouped into bundles which we called fascicles. And surrounding the entire muscle, we had a connective tissue. Surrounding each bundle, we had a connective tissue. And then surrounding each muscle fiber, we had connective tissue, given different names. Same way with a nerve is a bunch of axons. So on the outside, covering the entire nerve, is connective tissue which is called epineurium. And if you remember epi from epidermis, how it covers you on the outside. So epineurium covers the entire nerve. All of these axons are actually grouped into bundles which are known as fascicles. And each fascicle is covered by another connective tissue which is known as perineurium. Peri meaning going around. Each fascicle in turn has these individual axons, and each individual axon is covered by its own connective tissue sheath which is known as endoneurium. Endo is always on the inside. So endo on the inside, epi on the outside, and perineurium in between. So very similar to muscle which we saw. And inside the endoneurium, if the axon is myelinated, you'll find the myelin sheath. If there is no if the axon is not myelinated, there won't be a myelin sheath. Now let's classify nerves and also look at ganglia. So we have information which goes towards the central nervous system, and we have information which comes out of the central nervous system. And this to and fro information is carried by cranial and spinal nerves, and in between we have ganglia interspersed. So all those axons which carry information towards the central nervous system, we call them sensory nerves. All those axons which carry information out of the central nervous system and they are part of an entire nerve, we'll call that a motor nerve. So you may have, in certain cases, theoretically, you may have a nerve which is only taking which is a bunch of axons only taking information towards the central nervous system. And you may have a collection of axons forming a nerve which is only bringing information from the CNS to the muscles and glands, in which case we will call it a motor nerve. And then we may have nerves which do both. That means that nerve is a mixed nerve. Some of its axons carry information towards the central nervous system, others carry information away from the central nervous system. So we said that the peripheral nervous system was made up of cranial and spinal nerves. So we said in the earlier definition, peripheral consists of cranial, spinal nerves. These were the two main components. And then we said it also had ganglia and the receptors and the motor effectors. So receptors we've already talked about. They are the ones which send information. Motor effectors are the muscle and glands, and we'll talk of ganglia. So what we are left with is these cranial and spinal nerves. So if we look at this, spinal nerves are nerves which are mixed nerves. All spinal nerves are mixed nerves. That means coming from your skin below the neck, because below the neck and below, all of that part of your body is supplied by spinal nerves. So they take information from skin and muscle and joints towards the central nervous system. They also bring information from the central nervous system to all the muscles present here. So therefore, spinal nerves are mixed nerves. Cranial nerves, we'll see, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. Cranial nerves, however, are not necessarily mixed. There are some which only carry information towards the central nervous system. For example, the first cranial nerve is called the olfactory nerve. All it's responsible for is carrying the sensation of smell towards the central nervous system. So if you smelt something, that information is going to be carried by this first cranial nerve towards the central nervous system. Now when you react to that smell, say you wrinkle your nose or something like that, that is not brought by the first cranial nerve. It's actually brought back to the muscles of which will make you wrinkle your nose, and those are muscles of facial expression, which is the seventh cranial nerve. Do you see that? So then in the cranial nerve, some may be only sensory. So I'll give you an example, like the olfactory nerve is only sensory. Optic is also only sensory. There are others which are only motor. For example, the muscles of the tongue are supplied by the cranial nerve 12. All it does is comes and supplies muscles of the tongue. It doesn't carry information from any region of the mouth towards the brain and spinal cord. So this is only motor, only supplying muscle. So the 12th cranial nerve is one such example. And there are others which are similar to spinal nerves. That means they have a to and fro communication. The seventh cranial nerve is a good example. The facial nerve is a good example. We already saw that it has motor fibers going to muscles of facial expression. But it also carries taste sensation. So taste is a sensation. It also carries sensation from the back of the ear. There's a part of the ear from where touch, temperature, all that sensation is carried by the seventh cranial nerve. So seventh is a mixed nerve, behaving very similar to the spinal nerves. Now ganglia are structures which contain nerve cell bodies. So ganglia contain nerve cell bodies. And these are always present outside the central nervous system. For most part, we will see that ganglia are associated with the sensory nerve fibers. So ganglia are associated with sensory nerve fibers, in which case the type of neuron, the cell body of the type of neuron which is present inside the ganglia inside that ganglion is a pseudo-unipolar neuron. You remember that pseudo-unipolar neuron? It began a cell with one process, then it divided into two, one acting as an axon, one acting as a dendrite, right? So imagine an information, say you prick your hand or something, that information is coming from the receptor, traveling in this nerve, and now the cell body has to lie somewhere. That cell body lies in this ganglion, which is called the dorsal root ganglion. And then the next process goes towards the spinal cord. So you can see that this is a sensory neuron connected to a spinal nerve. And here this ganglion is the one which is connected to a spinal nerve. It's called the dorsal root ganglion. When we do cranial nerves, also you will see some cranial nerves also, their sensory fibers have ganglia associated with them. They are not called dorsal root ganglia then. They are called the sensory ganglia of cranial nerve 9 or sensory ganglia of cranial nerve 10. This dorsal root ganglia is only associated with spinal nerves. In any case, whether it is dorsal root ganglia or the sensory ganglia of cranial nerves, they always carry, because they are sensory, they always carry the cell bodies of pseudo-unipolar neurons. Later we will see that when we are doing the autonomic nervous system, which is a predominant or which is a mainly motor system, or entirely motor system, mainly seems to suggest it has some other function. It's an entirely motor system. There also you have ganglia present. Those ganglia will be motor or efferent neurons. And so those are different. So those efferent neurons then will be multipolar. So when we do the central nervous system, we'll come back to that. So for now, we are only going to deal with this sensory ganglia where the neurons are pseudo-unipolar. In this picture, you can see here, this is showing you the spinal cord. It is showing you this here is the spinal nerve. Notice how this spinal nerve has, and look at the, just look at the labels, somatic sensory neuron. So this, here the impulses are going towards the central nervous system. So it has sensory fibers. And then here impulses come out of the central nervous system. So here you can see somatic motor neurons. So these impulses come out of the central nervous system. So this spinal nerve therefore has both sensory and motor fibers. Do you see that? So therefore it is a mixed nerve. If I was showing you the brain, so if this was the brain and let's say we talked of the first cranial nerve. So this first cranial nerve will only have axons which go towards the brain. So it will be only sensory. Let's say the 12th cranial nerve, this 12th cranial nerve, it comes out from the medulla. This 12th cranial nerve has fibers which go to the tongue. So it has fibers which only bring information out of the central nervous system. So this will be purely motor. And then some cranial nerves will have information going towards and have information coming away. So they will behave like spinal nerves. So do you see the difference? All spinal nerves are mixed because they have both sensory information and motor information. Cranial nerves may either be sensory or motor or mixed. What I also want you to pay attention to is this part is the area which is called the spinal nerve, and it has sensory as well as motor neurons. But notice how the sensory and motor neurons kind of split. So the sensory neurons, after some time, they go their own way and the motor neurons exit by a different way. They finally meet up in the spinal nerve, but when they are attached or when they're going towards the spinal cord or first coming away from the spinal cord, they are split. So that it's like, you know, incoming calls going one way, outgoing calls coming out another way, okay? So just keep this part in mind because when we describe these spinal nerves, we'll be talking about this again. So let's look at cranial nerves first. In the peripheral nervous system, there are 12 pairs of cranial nerves. So when we did the brain and all its parts, if you remember, we did an area called the brain stem, which consisted of the midbrain, pons and medulla, and majority of the cranial nerves arise from the brain stem. So the 3rd to the 12th cranial nerves arise from the brain stem. The first 2 arise from the cerebrum. So only the first 2 arise from the cerebrum, otherwise the remaining arise from the brain stem. As we just said, they may be entirely sensory, that means their axons are only taking information towards the brain, or they may be motor only, which means they're bringing information out, going to muscle and glands, or they may be mixed, so they behave like spinal nerves. Some cranial nerves may have sensory ganglia associated with them. These sensory ganglia of the cranial nerves are similar to those dorsal root ganglia, only we don't call it dorsal root ganglia. You can call it dorsal root ganglion only when it is in the spinal nerve, because this is called the dorsal root and the ganglion is associated with this root. In the cranial nerves, we don't have anything like a dorsal or a ventral root, so therefore we can't call it dorsal root ganglion, but otherwise it is similar to that. So the neuron will be the same, just the name will be different, okay? Not all cranial nerves have these sensory ganglia, only some of them have them. So let's look at these cranial nerves. So here are the numbers given. You should know the name and you must also know the Roman numeral associated with them. You could get either one. So you can see abducens is 1, optic is 2, oculomotor is 3, trochlear is 4, trigeminal 5, abducens 6, facial 7, vestibulocochlear 8, glossopharyngeal 9, vagus 10, accessory 11 and hypoglossal 12. Some things you can kind of remember. The word glossal has to do with tongue. So hypoglossal, you can think of it below the tongue, so to do with tongue. Oculomotor, that means motor to oculus. Oculus means eye, so motor to the eye. Optic has to do with vision. The word optic. Olfactory obviously is the olfactory with smell. So some are, and facial is to do with muscles of facial expression. So some of them, you can remember that way. Others you've kind of got to learn the functions. So the next two slides give you the functions of the various cranial nerves which you should know. So I'm not going to read through that. It's given up here. In some of them, the third, the seventh, the ninth, and the 10th. So third, seventh, ninth, and 10th. You will notice that mentioned with them, you have something called parasympathetic component. You have something known as parasympathetic component. Okay? So for now, you may not understand this. When we do the autonomic nervous system and then you come back to this, then you will kind of be able to figure out what I mean by this parasympathetic component. But otherwise, here are the cranial nerves, 1 to 6 and 7 to 12, telling you what their function is. So this is this kind of gives you a good idea. So make sure you make little flashcards and you kind of write down the functions. Here is a good overview. So I like this chart where you can kind of quickly look. It's the same thing, but just given in less detail. So we look at smell, number 1. Vision, number 2. Muscles supplying the eyeball. That means they allow for movement of the eyeball. That means they allow you to look up, down, right, left, down and out, down and in, all that. This is the third, which is oculomotor, 4th and 6th. So 3rd, 4th and 6th. So they supply muscles of the eyeball. Sensory to the skin of the face and supplying muscles of mastication is 5th. Facial expression, as you can see, is 7th. Then we have again 3 nerves which carry taste from the tongue. So these are 7th, 9th and 10th. They carry taste fibers from the tongue. So it's kind of grouped together for you. Hearing and equilibrium, the function is that of 8th cranial nerve. Supplying muscles of the pharynx and larynx is 9th and 10th. Supplying muscles of the neck, the trapezius and sternocleidomastoid, which you did, is 11th. And muscles of the tongue is 12th. So this is like a quick overview, though some of these muscles, like the 7th, has a little bit more functions. As you can see, it supplies muscles of facial expression, but it also carries taste. Right? So you'll see that in the previous slide. Now here are some of those 4 nerves which are to do with parasympathetic system. And this parasympathetic system supplies muscles, smooth and cardiac, but it also supplies glands. The parasympathetic supplies glands, and those glands are the lacrimal gland, the salivary glands, the glands of the gastrointestinal tract, the glands of the respiratory system, like, the glands which produce mucus. So when you have a bad cold, for example, your nose is constantly flowing. Your gastric juices are produced, intestinal juices are produced. Those are the glands of the GI tract. So the parasympathetic system is associated or responsible for all these secretions. And it causes these secretions via these 4 cranial nerves. And it also acts on a smooth muscle in the eye. So the 3rd cranial nerve is not for secretion. It causes the sphincter to constrict. So it causes pupillary constriction. But otherwise, you can see up here salivation and lacrimation, salivation supplying muscles of the various parts of the body. So this is not something that is going to come to you immediately. So try and always kind of first look at this, put together some things, and then go back and make flashcards. So here's a little song, a video that I found, which I thought might kind of help you. So watch it when you go back home, watch it a couple of times, and that might help you to learn about this.
Olfactory number 1 for your sense of smell. Optic nerve is number 2, lets you see real well. Ocular motor 3, lens and lids of eyes. Trochlear is number 4, eyes counterclockwise. Sense skin, teeth and tongue, trigeminal is 5. Also helps you masticate, abduce and 6 moves eyes. Facial 7th nerve for your sense of taste. Makes saliva and your tears, muscles move your face. Vestibulocochlear, sense from inner ear. The vestibules for balancing, the 8th nerve lets you hear. Glossopharyngeal, mixed nerve number 9. Impulses come from the throat, swallowing we'll find. Mixed vagus number 10, organs kept in check. The spinal accessory, 11, loose back neck. Hypoglossal 12, muscles move the tongue. Cranial nerves 1 to 12, the song has now been sung.
So it's a bit catchy, kind of lets you remember some things. So take a look at that. Let's look at spinal nerves now. So cranial nerves are 12 pairs. Spinal nerves are 31 pairs of spinal nerves. This is different from vertebrae. How many vertebrae were there? 30? How many vertebrae were there? Total? 33, yes. But spinal nerves are less. They are 31. Also, there's a little difference. There were 7 cervical vertebrae, but there are 8 cervical spinal nerves. Okay? The lumbar, thoracic and sacral are the same as the vertebrae. So there were 12 thoracic vertebrae, 12 thoracic spinal nerves. 5 lumbar vertebrae, 5 lumbar spinal nerves. 5 sacral vertebrae, 5 sacral spinal nerves. There were 4 coccygeal vertebrae, but there's only 1 coccygeal nerve. So that's how you have you have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, okay? Now these spinal nerves, they are attached. You saw that previous diagram that I mentioned to you by those roots. So they are attached to the spinal cord. So the nerve, actually, this part is the spinal nerve. This area here is the spinal nerve. So this spinal nerve is what is present in the intervertebral foramen. You remember that when the vertebrae line up together, there's a foramen present between them, and that's where the spinal nerve is present. So it's really a short stem. But where it's attached to the spinal cord, that's where this nerve actually splits. Because it decides, I'm going to send sensory information one way, and I'm going to get motor information coming out another way. So the dorsal root, so it's attached by what is called 2 roots, one present posteriorly, one present anteriorly. So the dorsal or posterior root and ventral or anterior root, you remember these are synonyms. So the dorsal root carries information towards the spinal cord, so it will carry sensory fibers or sensory impulses. And this will have those pseudo-unipolar neurons, and the cell body of those pseudo-unipolar neurons will be in this dorsal root ganglion. So this is the dorsal root ganglion. The ventral root is where is the route through which information comes out of the spinal cord. So this is motor information. So since this is information which is coming out from the spinal cord, so the headquarters are like in the spinal cord, so the cell bodies will begin in the spinal cord, in the ventral horn, and these are multipolar neurons. They travel in the ventral root. And since the autonomic nervous system, we haven't done that, but we will do that. The autonomic nervous system begins in a part of the gray matter called the lateral horn. So the cell bodies for the autonomic nervous system will begin in the lateral horn. They also will be multipolar, and they will come out through this ventral root, and become part of the spinal nerve. So that's how you see that the spinal nerve is a mixed nerve. So those roots join to form the spinal nerve, which exits through the intervertebral foramen. So this way all spinal nerves become mixed. So now here is where I want you all to, I gave you that little paper, so I'm going to have you all draw. So now let's look at, so we had this sensory root, we had this motor root, and we had the spinal nerve, and the spinal nerve emerged at the intervertebral foramen, okay? If you look at a person from the side, or let me just take, it's easier for me to draw the fetus. So if I draw the fetus like this, and this is the way the fetus is developing, so here's where the eyes are, and somewhere here at the back is where the spinal cord is going to develop, okay, and then the brain up here. So these spinal nerves will come out like this, right, through the intervertebral foramen. You get that? They're going to all emerge like from the intervertebral foramen. These spinal nerves will have to travel towards the back of the body, and they also will have to travel towards the front of the body to do their job. So they'll have to get information. So imagine if you have a person like this, the spinal nerves come out here at near the vertebral column. They have to go all the way to the back, plus they have to come all the way to the front also, so that they can carry information from the skin and everything from the back of the body, skin and everything from the front of the body, and also supply muscles towards the back and muscles towards the front. So what happens with these spinal nerves is, because as you can see, the spinal nerve is a really small little stump. It is the part which is lying in the intervertebral foramen. This spinal nerve it becomes very much like, you know, in your house when you need to kind of make two connections using only one wire, you splice that wire, right? And you kind of put it in two things so that one connection does the job of both. So same way, just like that, imagine this spinal nerve gets spliced. It has a branch which goes all the way towards the back. So it'll supply skin and muscle at the back. It has a branch which comes all the way to the front, where it'll supply skin and muscle towards the front. These branches which it gets spliced into, those branches are called rami. Ramus is singular. So as the spinal nerve comes out, so when it comes out from the intervertebral foramen like this, one part of it goes towards the back of the body, another part comes towards the front of the body. So the part going towards the back is known as the dorsal ramus. The part coming to the front is called the ventral ramus. They are exactly like the spinal nerve. The only thing is you just spliced or broke this, you know, like divided the spinal nerve into half with sensory and motor fibers in both, right? So if you look at this picture here, can you see that the dorsal ramus is carrying sensory fibers, because sensory fibers are shown in blue, motor fibers are shown in red. So from the back of the body, from either the skin or proprioceptive or joints, sensory information from the back will travel through the dorsal ramus, come into the spinal nerve, then go into the dorsal root and have its cell body there and get into the dorsal horn. Information from the front of the body will initially travel in the sensory information, will initially travel in the ventral ramus, come into the nerve, and then again go through the dorsal root. So can you see all sensory information is going through dorsal root, but the rami are mixed, just like the spinal nerve. Motor information exits from the ventral horn, comes in the ventral root. If it has to go to the muscles on the front of the body, it will go into the ventral ramus. If it has to go to muscles on the back of the body, it's called dorsal ramus. So roots, can you see, are medial to the spinal nerve. Rami are exactly like the spinal nerve, but they are also lateral to the nerve and serve the front and back of the body. Have you followed this part? Okay. So now let's answer a few questions. So read very carefully. So look at what you drew and answer this question. I'd like a few more answers. Oops. Okay. The correct answer is number 3. Dorsal is not efferent. Remember, dorsal was afferent, so that was wrong. They are not connected by rami. So let's go back. See here, this is the nerve. This is the spinal cord. See, how is it connected to the cord? It's connected by these roots. It's not connected by the rami. It's connected by the roots. So it is not rami either. It's by dorsal or afferent roots and ventral or efferent roots. We didn't have dorsal and ventral ganglia. We only had a dorsal root ganglion. I didn't mention any ventral ganglion. So this answer is wrong as well. Okay? Okay. Here, where do the cell bodies of the motor neurons lie? And again, this was the reason I had you all draw that, so that I made sure you drew it. And we mentioned where these motor neurons began. Oops. The cell bodies of motor neurons lie in the ventral horn. The dorsal root ganglion contains cell bodies of sensory neurons. So here, see this dorsal root ganglion has that sensory neuron. This is the ventral root through which the motor neuron comes out, and it begins up here in the ventral horn. So the motor neuron begins in the ventral horn. So they lie in the ventral horn. Is this a true statement or false? Yes, this is true. Sensory fibers enter through the dorsal root. Motor fibers exit through the ventral root. So it's really important for you to look at these images very carefully. So look at these sensory fibers. Sensory neuron means sensory fibers through the dorsal root. Plus it also gives it up here. Motor fibers, ventral root. Motor neurons, so they have to exit through the ventral root. So that was a true statement. Okay, suppose you cut the ventral root. What would happen? So if you theoretically could pick one spinal nerve and you just cut the ventral root, Good, yes. Since the ventral root carried motor fibers, if you cut the ventral root, the muscles supplied by the nerve would lose their, they would not be able to act. You won't have loss of sensation because, again, that's why, once again, my primary reason for making you all draw that. Imagine I say that you cut this, you're cutting it here. So what happens? Sensations are still able to go because they are using another pathway. Here, if I've cut this, something coming out can't go any further, so this area, the muscles which are supplied by this spinal nerve will no longer get their nerve supply, so they won't be able to act. Now, if the ventral ramus was injured, what would happen? Both, yes, very good. Both would be, both sensory and motor fibers will be involved because remember the rami are just like the spinal nerve. So here, this is just like the spinal nerve. So you get both sensory and motor being involved. So that's why both was the correct answer. Okay, last question up here, which is correct regarding spinal nerves? C is the correct, B is the correct answer. B is the correct answer, yeah. 8 cervical, 12 thoracic, 5 lumbar, 5 sacral, and 1 coccygeal. Yeah, so B is the correct answer.